Let me say that this is the fourth time that I've been in Moscow. The first time was back in 1987 when I was most of your ages and when you were, most of you, not born or barely born. And that from a nearly 30-year perspective, I can't help but be incredibly pleased at the look of Moscow. For one thing, it now has the normal problem of an industrial city, that is traffic jams, which it did not have 27 years ago. And at least when your problems are normal ones rather than abnormal problems, you can look to others for help and advice and for possible models as to how to solve them. While 27 years ago, the problems of Russia and then the Soviet Union were distinctly abnormal problems, shared by few countries on Earth. And so I see enormous progress and thus enormous hope. All you have to do is draw a straight line extrapolation between 27 years ago and today, continue it into the future, and the future looks bright around here. The future, however, looks less bright, or at least less bright than it looked 10 years ago, kind of elsewhere in the world. Because over the past 5 years or so, I at least have had to rethink a number of things that I knew, or that I thought I knew, about how the world worked, about how economies worked, and about how the global and U.S. economy ought to be organized. So let me try to give 3 sets of perspectives as to what I think we should think now about the present, future, destination, and appropriate policies for the world economy. First, give a 5-year perspective, then give a 50-year perspective. Then, if there is remaining time, give a 500-year perspective, and possibly end by venturing outside economics to look a little bit at other areas of the social sciences and how they affect us all as global citizens. And I'll try to wind up the me talking about this part by, say, the hour, in 45 minutes, to leave plenty of times for questions and answers and dialogue elsewhere. Because at least when I sat in your place, I knew that most of the time what I wanted to hear was people answering questions that I or my fellow students had, rather than people telling me things which I could have read or had read in things that they had previously written. So let me start with the 5-year perspective, which is that the past 5 years have been, from my perspective as an analyst of the U.S. economy, depressing and astonishing, because the future that I thought the U.S. economy had 5 years ago has vanished and has been replaced by something much more pessimistic. And so 5 years ago, 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I would have said that the future of the U.S. economy looked very bright, that we could expect growth in excess of 3% per year in the U.S. economy, a pace at which U.S. real GDP doubles every generation, doubles every 23 years or so. And that at such a pace, the U.S. would become richer very rapidly. It would also serve as an engine of demand and growth and be a good market for the rest of the world and help to pull the rest of the world along as well, both with its enormous demand for other countries' products as an importer of last resort and as a source of new technologies. And the United States labor force would be fully employed because the United States had a very flexible labor market and had aggressive macroeconomic policies aimed at producing full employment. And with full employment, you were guaranteed a relatively equal income distribution because firms would feel themselves short of workers who could do productive things, and so would be eager to bid up workers' wages and salaries. That's not the future that we see now. Now we're looking forward to a world in which we have 1.5% per year rather than 3% per year. Core productivity, or perhaps real GDP growth in the United States and in the rest of the North Atlantic. We no longer have a doubling of GDP every 25 years. Instead, it'll come every 50 years, if that. And that seems to be so, even though the technological opportunities for faster growth that we saw 5 or 10 years ago seem to remain. We're just not nearly as good at grasping them as they thought we were. And we're also going to see no return in the North Atlantic to mid-2000s levels of activity. It is the belief that I and that other neoliberal and neo-Keynesian economists thought we had 10 years ago, that governments could exercise a very small amount of central planning through their central banks, and that way they could guarantee both stable prices and full employment. That's gone out the window. As long as central banks are focused on stable prices, and there seem to be powerful political reasons for them to do so for the foreseeable future, we are going to have high unemployment, we are going to have low labor force utilization throughout the North Atlantic core of the world economy, throughout the United States and throughout Western Europe, especially in the southern part of Western Europe. And that means rising income inequality in the industrial core. Because we're still in a world where most people earn most of their income off of their skills and their work. And when there's excess supply of labor, it's going to be capital and enterprise that earn the most and labor that earns less. So we can look forward to rising income inequality as well in the North Atlantic industrial core and all the political problems that brings rise to. Looking outside the United States and outside the narrowly North Atlantic industrial core, the fact that you have slow growth in the industrial core has powerful implications for the rest of the world. Yes, we do expect to see some continued catch-up by China and India as they slowly move their populations off of subsistence agriculture and into urban industrial and post-industrial employments. But slower catch-up than we thought we would see 5 or 10 years ago when we expected the United States to be an importer of last resort for the goods that China and for the services that India was going to produce. We are going to see continued prosperity for resource producers like Russia, in fact, like Russia especially, as the world's major energy resource producer, because the world is short of energy-based resources. Or rather, we're going to see continued prosperity for resource producers like Russia unless or until the political global warming crisis comes. Now, this is not going to come in the next 5 years. This is not going to come in the next 10 years. But if you look out at the 50-year trajectory, you do have to start to wonder about Russia's continued ability to export oil through the next 2 generations, although its ability to export natural gas is secure, right? Gazprom is going to be very happy over the next 2 generations, if only because natural gas has only half the climate load of oil and coal. And so, should global warming become a major international cause for political action, demand for natural gas will increase. We also have expanded dominance of democratic politics, or perhaps of democratic political forms, although those remain, as always, imperfect, and the fact that we're going to have slower growth than expected, both in emerging markets and also the North Atlantic industrial core, is going to put pressure on those political forms. And pressure on democratic political forms is, as the history of the 20th century tells us, never a fortunate thing to have. Because regimes that are freed from democratic political constraints of normal parliamentary or representative governments at times evolve in very strange and destructive ways, both for themselves and for others. So that's the 5 or 10-year perspective. That we used to think we had the right model for how to generate global prosperity in the North Atlantic. It was, by and large, the neoliberal model. That the state should step back, that the state should focus on redistributing income to the extent that the market failed to deliver a proper distribution of income, that the state should focus on compensating for externalities through the incentives it provided businesses, and that the state should engage in limited but only limited amounts of industrial policy and central planning, largely focused on central bank management of interest rates, and perhaps Treasury management of exchange rates, too, to make sure that they were neither too high nor too low, neither too high to create a Dutch disease, nor too low to create inflation, but that by and large the neoliberal order had it right. Today we can no longer think so, because the policies that I thought were the obvious ones for countries to adopt have failed to produce stable prosperity over the past 6 years in the North Atlantic, and are holding no prospect for a return to normal levels of activity and to what we used to think of were normal levels of growth. So perhaps from a 50-year perspective, it's time to start opening things up again and to think about whether there might be alternative political economic models, perhaps involving more government, perhaps involving less, perhaps involving a different role for the government than the very limited neoliberal government role that I and a lot of other economists would have told you is the right one 5 or 10 years ago. And in fact, if you look back at the century and a half that ends with World War II, that ends with the Great Patriotic War, we see that there seem to be many systems of political economy that had considerable success. That basically only, if you look at major countries of the world, that only India as a country does catastrophically badly between 1800 and 1947 as far as economic growth is concerned. Japan has a very activist government interested in forcing industrial development largely through market-led activities, but still focused on rich country, strong army, imperialism, adopt as many technologies from abroad as possible, reward your industrialists, especially your industrialists who export, as much as possible. And that road appears to do about as well in relative terms as the United States' much more free market plus enormous amounts of government investment in infrastructure, communications, and transportation effort. And even the Russian government, even under a czarist government that for the first century has little idea of what it is doing, and then under a communist government from 1917 to 1947 that is desperately attempting to industrialize Russia in advance of what turned out to be correct fears of invasion from the West, and then has to deal with the incredible destruction of World War II, that even Russia sees growth about as fast as the United States between 1800 and 1947, in spite of the destruction of World War II, in spite of all the inefficiencies of industrial development under the communist regime. The ability to devote an awful lot of your industrial capacity to investment, plus the ability to import advanced technologies from Western Europe and the United States proves to be immensely valuable as far as GDP is concerned. Now, as far as human welfare is concerned, the picture is considerably darker, simply because whenever you have an enormously thumb-fingered, centrally planned government, it is going to make mistakes, and it is going to make mistakes by accident, simply because the lines of communication between what's actually happening on the ground and what's happening in the Kremlin are going to get clogged. That Joseph Stalin did not want 5 million Ukrainian peasants to die in the 1930s during the collectivization of agriculture. For one thing, he could have used those 5 million peasants in the Red Army during World War II. For another, the fact that nearly everyone living in the Ukraine had a close relative who had starved to death in the early 1930s meant that there was a lot more sympathy in the Ukraine in 1941 for the invading Nazis until people figured out what the Nazi regime really was. That was a catastrophic political economic mistake. That was not something that Stalin had intended. All he intended to do was simply gather the people peacefully into collective farms and then use the agricultural surplus to fuel the industrialization of Great Russia. But that's what happened. And then its aftermath, Stalin grew rightly paranoid. Because in the aftermath of that catastrophe, if the other people in the Politburo were not plotting against him, well, they certainly should have been. And so we had the purges of the late 1930s. Yet in spite of all that, in spite of World War II, in spite of the presence of 3.5 million Nazi troops kind of everywhere from Stalingrad to the then Leningrad and over to Odessa, when you look at the world in 1947, you see one in which practically every political economic system has managed to produce substantial growth, except for India's. And in India, what you had was British colonial rule, a great deal of British emphasis on strengthening the market economy wherever it could, private property in agriculture, private property in commerce and industry, but no interest at all in educational uplift and little interest in non-military infrastructure in India. And the lesson that most people, or that many people, drew from that history from 1800 to 1947 was that a good many systems seemed to produce significant amounts of economic growth. And indeed, from 1947 to 1974, you could say that, once again, the same lesson applied, that there were many successes. That the Soviet Union, as it stood in 1974, was not nearly as prosperous as the United States, and not even as prosperous as Japan, but still quite prosperous relative to any previous part of Russian or of outside Russian Soviet history. Japan had continued its kind of state-led market development model and had done very well. The United States had continued its much more neoliberal model and had been forcing the growth of technology with considerable success. Once again, only India is the negative outlier. And there were, as of 1974, two theories for why India was the negative outlier. The first was that there was simply something wrong with Indian culture and its orientation toward the economy, related in some way to traditional Indian religions or caste systems of one form or another. And the second was that India had been unlucky in before 1947 in its British colonial masters' domination and lack of interest in forcing Indian education and Indian infrastructure, and then unlucky after 1947 in the Nehru dynasty's desire to steer an equivalent, or to steer a midway path between the Soviet Union and the United States. And so you had too much central planning for private business to be interested in doing anything other than lobbying the government, but too little central planning to actually significantly mobilize resources to move them from agriculture into industry in a very rapid way. That being said, starting in 1974, things changed in the 50-year perspective. And from 1974 to 2008, we had a neoliberal era. We had a general shift in India, in China, throughout Western Europe, and also in the United States, to a belief that even the limited role of social democracy and the state that the United States had in 1974 was too much, and that the government needed to pay less attention to equality, less attention to industrial policy, less attention to managing the market, and simply step back and let the market rip, accepting that you'd have greater wealth inequality, but that greater income and wealth inequality would produce significantly greater economic growth. And this worked for China. This worked for China amazingly. The stepping back from Maoism into Deng Xiaopingism and the desire to get rich is glorious worked astonishingly successfully. This worked for India after Rajiv Gandhi at the start of the 1980s begins to dismantle the license Raj of his mother and grandfather, and India starts on the trajectory of becoming a modern industrial economy, or rather a post-industrial economy, since its expertise appears to be service exports rather than goods exports, on which it has been so successful in the past generation, less successful only than China. But in the United States, the neoliberal era does not see an acceleration of growth. It sees a sharp rise in income inequality, but in fact slower growth than the preceding generation. Russia is somewhat of a puzzle, as the Soviet model appears to run out of steam completely. So much so that the 1980s are then a lost decade for the Soviet Union, and the 1990s decade of transition is a temporary economic catastrophe for Russia and the rest of what's now and near abroad, with the 2000s seeing only a recovery to a level of prosperity that straight-line extrapolation from 1947 to 1974 would say could have been generated under the old Soviet regime. Now, the shift to neoliberalism in Russia is justified by the belief that a continuation of the pre-1974 Soviet regime's rate of growth was simply not on the cards. That Yuri Andropov, when he was general secretary, had attempted reforms to produce in that direction. They had not worked. And Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin had then set off on their new path. But the necessity for a new path is still quite puzzling. Right? That when you look at the people who were in charge of the Soviet Union during the late 1970s and the first half of the 1980s, when the development model first runs into enormous trouble, and when it becomes clear that the largest component of Soviet production is construction that is not finished, and that will in fact never be finished, construction that will be abandoned for political or bureaucratic reasons before it is finished. The people at the head of the government, that Alexei Kosygin was the man in charge of moving Russian industry out of the way of the Nazi armies in 1941 and setting it up beyond the Urals in new factories in new cities in time so it could produce in 1942 and 1943 the tanks that won the battles of Stalingrad and Kursk. That is an incredible economic, political, and military achievement. To move an entire industrial complex out of the way of an invading army 500 miles to the east, set it up again, and have it start producing again within 6 months. No one has ever managed to do anything like that since. The Chinese task of building up the area around Hong Kong to produce light textile and consumer goods exports over the past 20 years. That's a much easier task. They took much longer to do it. Presumably, Alexei Kosygin and his team knew something about industrial management in 1941, 1942, and 1943 as relatively young men. That the old Alexei Kosygin in the Kremlin in the 1970s and 1980s had forgotten, or no longer had the energy to do, or had the wrong people working for him, or couldn't maintain the control systems, or simply was too tired. That perhaps in the last analysis, the crisis of the Soviet Union was mostly a crisis of the fact that nobody ever retired. And as you grow older, you get more feeble and less energetic. It is still a puzzle. I don't think we understand the history terribly well. If only because the same considerations that we market-based economists use to explain the failure of the Soviet economy to grow from 1977 to 1985, those considerations apply as well to the Soviet economy of the 1950s and to the Soviet economy of the 1960s as well. During which the Soviet Union was growing at least as fast as the United States, In fact, most economists believed it was growing faster, that allocative inefficiencies from the lack of market signals were outweighed simply by the ability to mobilize resources for investment that the centrally planning regime then had. Be that as it may, as of 2008, the neoliberal paradigm was dominant. The view was that India's attempt by a license Raj to split the difference between centrally planned and market regimes had been a failure and had been rightly abandoned. The belief was that even if central planning has its role during World War II, that in a modern post-industrial or industrial economy, you definitely needed a market economy. And the neoliberal belief that the government should have a very light hand on the market economy. That too much worry about income inequality was counterproductive and growth reducing, and too much focus on central planning through any tools other than a central bank interested in stable prices and appropriate interest rates was counterproductive. Those were the views that virtually all Western and most non-Western economists held in 2008, and that's why the past 6 years have come as such a surprise. That none of us expected a halving of the rate of potential output growth, and current forecasts that see that reduction as permanent. None of us had expected that the North Atlantic core economies would fall 8% below their productive potential, and then stay 8% below their productive potential, kind of no matter what was going on. So now we face a great puzzle. Perhaps back in 2008 we should have been smarter. Perhaps we shouldn't have ignored the lost decade of Japan's post-1990 economy and the lessons about the ability of market economies to suffer from persistent high unemployment and slack resource utilization in amounts that would make Janos Kornai kind of stunned at how far an economy can fall short of its productive potential. But we didn't. Perhaps we should have taken the financial disruptions of 1997-98 more seriously, rather than saying, oh, that's what happens in developing East Asian countries that don't have sophisticated financial systems. Our bankers on Wall Street are much smarter than the bankers in Kuala Lumpur and in Bangkok, which they turned out not to be come 2008. Joe Stiglitz especially made a career in 2009 and 2010 at taking everything that Wall Street bankers had said in 1997, 1998 about what was going wrong with banking in Bangkok and saying this applies to New York in 2008 and 2009 just as well. Certainly we paid too little attention to the growth of inequality and to the potential political blowback from growing inequality in the North Atlantic, if only because it drives the values and concerns of a political power structure that inevitably responds more to the rich, away from the problems and concerns of the people as a whole, and thus threatens to undermine legitimacy. End of the model. Since 2008, Japan has gone absolutely nowhere. The United States has gone absolutely nowhere. Russia continues to burble on progressing, in large part because the price of its energy exports has remained relatively high because the world remains short of energy or resources. Only India has managed to continue to grow substantially since 2008. And right now, everyone is very worried about India and other emerging market economies. And I know that I, at least, do not envy India's new central bank president, Raghuram Rajan, his current dilemma, because it seems that he is faced with the problem of either letting the rupee depreciate as people decide that there is no longer money to be made by making loans in India and financing them from borrowing in New York because there's too much exchange rate risk, either letting the rupee depreciate in order to make people no longer fear exchange rate risk associated with rupee positions. But if he pursues that road of allowing depreciation, then he faces the risk of an inflationary spiral in India, which he has a mandate to prevent. On the other hand, if he keeps the rupee where it was recently, if he validates expectations of constant exchange rates, then he creates a recession in India, no growth, and a fall in production. Only if he manages to hit the sweet spot exactly will he be able to avoid both a recession in India and excessive rupee depreciation that will set off inflation. And it's not at all clear there is even a sweet spot to hit. So right now, it's not at all clear that there is any model for successful growth in the world economy, other than being a large, extremely energy resource country that can continue to export its natural gas and its oil at a very healthy price for the world market. And even in the 50-year perspective, it's not at all clear that that's sustainable, because global warming is highly likely to come unless all of our climate models are substantially and collectively wrong for some reason we do not understand. The world come 2050 will be 1 degree Celsius warmer than the world of today, and the world of 2100 will be 2 degrees warm or 3 degrees warmer than the world of today. It might be 1 degree, it might be 5 degrees, I'm bet on 3 degrees. And as that warming happens, continued export of the carbon energy resources that produce that warming is going to become more and more fraught. Now, Gazprom is going to do absolutely fine. Right? We're going to be burning a lot of carbon fuels for at least a century, and because natural gas has only half the warming load of oil or coal, we're going to be burning our natural gas. Right? That Russia's natural gas resources are going to be an enormous source of wealth for a long time to come, and the shareholders, managers, and workers of Gazprom are going to be very happy as they become the preferential carbon-based energy resource of the global warming world. The coal producers of the Donbass are going to be significantly less happy, as are the oil companies. As at some point over the next 2 generations, the world is collectively going to tell the oil producers to stop producing your stuff to be burned, and instead let's reserve it for the future when it can be a productive organic chemical feedstock for plastics and other chemical industries. It will become a resource to be reserved for the future, but no longer a source of current prosperity. How fast that transition is going to take place, nobody knows. Certainly the large economies of the Northern Hemisphere, that for us, global warming is not a problem for a century. A Moscow that is 3 degrees Celsius warmer on average is not obviously a worse thing. A wheat belt that moves north by 150 miles from the Ukraine into Great Russia is, say, a bad thing as for the southern part of the Ukraine, as it acquires a climate more like that of the semi-desert Middle East. A bonanza for farmers who wish to farm the former forest lands of Great Russia. Similarly for the United States, it's only the carbon-based future beyond 2100, when the world warms up much more, that there are problems for the rich economies of the northern temperate zones. However, there are enormous problems much, much earlier, that at least the people currently running the climate models say that within 30 years we lose Bengal entirely. That the combination of rising sea levels plus possibly rising typhoon intensity in the Bay of Bengal means that areas where 200 million people currently live will not be habitable. At least will not be habitable without getting drowned once every 25 years, within 50 years. And there also are the great problems of China, India, Pakistan, and of what would be Bangladesh, were it not likely to be underwater over the next 50 years, which are that they have 2 billion subsistence farmers living in the great river valleys of Asia, right, in the Yellow, Yangtze, Mekong, Brahmaputra, Ganges, and Indus valleys. People who have no industrial skills, no industrial era assets except the land that they own near the riverbanks, and that land requires that there be enough snow on the Tibetan plateau and that it melt on the right place, that there's water to irrigate their fields, but not so much snow and not so much melt that they get flooded out. And we really do not know whether global warming means either less snow on the Tibetan plateau or more snow and a faster melt on the Tibetan plateau. But we would have to be very, very lucky for it not to mean one of the two, which means that sometime within the next 2 generations, global warming is going to become a life or death issue for the people and the leaders of China and India. And at that point, at least one of them is likely to be a global superpower. And thus, if we in the North Atlantic continue to use carbon-based burning energy technologies, they will be very angry at us. That's the 50-year perspective. And so looking forward to Russia in the 50-year perspective, there's the question of what kind of economy does Russia evolve when it can rely on natural gas but not on oil exports to earn foreign exchange, and how should it shape its political and economic future, given that the things that we North Atlantic economists were telling you 10 years ago about the desirability of the neoliberal model now appear to be significantly past their sell-by date. That is, we can't tell you anymore that simply having a central bank manage the economy in the interest of price stability, full employment, will produce a high level of economic activity and price stability. We can't tell you that the government should restrict most of its activities to simply compensating for externalities and a little bit of social democratic redistribution, and that will produce an effective distribution of income. We can't even tell you that. The government support for technology along the lines that the Western European countries and the U.S. have provided it over the past generation is the right road for technology transfer and to maximize the rate of technological progress, if only because the industrial core now seems to be leaving a lot of low-hanging fruit from technological progress still on the tree, given what's happened to the rate of growth of economic potential over the past 5 years. In short, we need a new model, or at least we need new thinking. We especially need new thinking, given that we continue to have failures of global governments, not just in the economic but in the political sphere. And we also continue to have failures of national governance in terms of managing to preserve both democratic legitimacy and also preserve voter trust in technocratic competence. That in the United States right now, there are an awful lot of voters who are extremely angry because they thought the government had promised them a full employment economy, and it turns out that the government has been unable to do so. Now, the fact that this anger has kind of paralyzed the U.S. government so that it isn't adopting any of the many potential roads of action that might restore it to full employment, That's there, but that doesn't influence the fact that the United States government has lost an awful lot of democratic legitimacy over the past 7 years because of its inability to deliver full employment and price stability. If only because since the days of the Great Depression in the 1930s, that's what a developed industrial country government has been asked to deliver. While preparing this talk, I happened to find a passage in which John Maynard Keynes in the 1920s was writing in a similar period, the period after the World War I, during which the North Atlantic economies faced similar problems that the old policies of the government seemed unable to guarantee, either full employment or a properly equitable distribution of income. And Keynes found himself commenting on a book by Leon Trotsky, then newly exiled from the Soviet Union as Joseph Stalin drove him out. And Keynes protested that Trotsky seemed to know it was absolutely obvious what to do, and that the only basic problem was that people wouldn't do it. In Trotsky's case, that the British leaders of the Labour Party in the 1930s would not stage an equivalent in Britain of the October Revolution, and if only they'd do it, everything would be well. But Keynes said the real problem was that all political parties alike have their origins in past ideas and not in new ideas. And that what we need now is new thinking. And yet right now we don't seem to have much new thinking. That is, the faction of economists that I belong to, call them broadly the neoliberals, that our response, and I include myself in that, seems to be that the economy's not doing well. Well, we simply need to clap louder. We simply need to make more applause. And if we make more applause, perhaps it will restore confidence. And if we restore confidence, and if only we pursue sound fiscal and monetary policies, we can get the world we thought we lived in back in 2007 with full employment, price stability, and relatively rapid technological progress back. And we do this because right now we don't have a much better idea. But that's not terribly convincing even to me. I still think it's the best strategy to follow, but that's only because I don't have a better one. There's China's oligarchy's view, which is that you should trust in us, and you should trust in us and our educational system and our system of recruitment that produces kind of the oligarchical government of China. On the grounds that it works, that it's produced the most rapid and successful period of industrial development over the past generation and a half that anyone has ever seen. Well, the problem with that is that China had a lot of low-hanging fruit it could pick. China had a lot of advantages because it started out so very poor. And you would have to be very, very, very optimistic indeed to believe that China's future over the next generation is going to see anything like the growth that China has in the past, which will then leave the Chinese government in a generation facing the same problems that the rest of the world does about producing full employment and balanced growth. But the only problem is that China's government then will not have democracy as a legitimating factor. They won't be able to say we were chosen by the voters. They won't really have tradition as a legitimating factor. They certainly won't have any form of dynastic legitimacy. And without rapid growth, their claim to have special access to understand how the world works will be gone as well, which will leave only nationality as a force that China's oligarchy can use in a generation to justify its rule. And if the history of the 20th century teaches us anything, it's that countries whose governments rely on nationality to justify their rule are things that are very scary for their neighbors. And it's true that Russia has a bunch of neighbors between it and China right now, or between most of it and China right now. But those are relatively thinly populated. That's got to be a source of concern. And Europe's oligarchy Europe's oligarchy says that the big problem is that Southern Europeans are paid too much, that we need to trust in a great upward leap in income inequality within Western Europe, that the European Union, as it was designed, was a promise that everyone in Europe, in Western Europe, would soon be able to live like Germans, or like West Germans, and that promise can't be kept, and we need to step back from that. The problem is that most of the voters of Europe did not sign up for an increase in Europe-wide income inequality when they agreed to join the European Union. And it's unclear how these policies can in fact be enacted in Europe today, or what the political reaction there would be. So in the last analysis, I would appeal to you, right? That my generation, the people who are now in their 50s and their 60s, we took the world in the 1980s and the 90s, and we bet on market-oriented growth and a smaller state, and trust in a very limited form of central planning relying on central banks, and an open world trading system, and said that we hoped that would generate a prosperous world economy, rapid technological progress and economic growth, and full employment. And up until 2007, it looked like we were winning our bet. But now it looks much more likely that we've lost it, or at most broken even, rather than won it. That the institutions that I and my elders set up in the 80s and the 90s do not seem to produce nearly as bright a future for the world as we thought they did 10 years ago. And so it's going to be your turn to try to build new institutions and set the world on a new course over the next 20 years. And we wish you luck. And to say that you probably will have luck, it is time now to step back and take the 500-year perspective and reflect on what the world looked like 500 years ago, whether here in Moscow or in Western Europe or in San Francisco where I lived, where the overwhelming 90% of people are still subsistence peasants, lucky to be able to produce enough so they can eat 2,500 calories a day, right, on average. And where literacy rates in the world are at 5% at most, and that 5% includes everyone who knows how to sign their name. That is, the amount of progress that the world has made over the past 500 years in terms of creating a better life for nearly all of us, and a much, much better life for some of us, in spite of the fact that the numbers of people on the world have increased 15-fold over the past 500 years, that we're now supporting 7 billion rather than 350 million people on the world, and thus our potential farm sizes are only 1/20th as large. That's absolutely amazing and mind-blowing. And the fact that there's an indication that there still is more low-hanging technological fruit to be grasped should make us all hope, at least, that the difficulties and problems of the past 10 years, and in all likelihood of the next 5 or 10, are just a passing phase, and that you people are going to have somewhat better luck, at least, than my generation has. And let me stop there, and thank you for listening.